whipped me 3 times with rods. I was stoned once. 3 times I suffered shipwrecks. I once spent an entire night and the next day drifting at sea. I have been on many very long trips. I faced dangers from rivers and thieves. I faced dangers from my own people, the Jews, and also from the Gentiles. I faced dangers in cities, in deserts, and in seas. And I faced dangers from men who claim to be believers but are not. I have worked hard and long hours and endured many sleepless nights. I have been hungry and thirsty and often left without anything to eat. I have shivered from the cold without having enough clothing to keep me warm.
The Apostle Paul not only deeply understood the meaning of suffering for the cause of Christ, but his life itself was a moving testimony of unwavering devotion and perseverance. Every blow, every wound he suffered in the name of his faith were not simply physical tests, but palpable manifestations of his unwavering commitment to the message of Christ. Dear listener, in this video, we will not only explore Paul's story, but we will dive into the very heart of his testimony. Before continuing, please support us by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. Don't forget to activate the notification bell so that YouTube notifies you of each new content we publish. Let's get started. In contrast to those who might boast of their titles as an apostle or academic, their world travels or their material possessions, Paul found his true pride and value in something completely different. He did not seek to impress with external achievements or earthly riches. Instead, he preferred to highlight his spiritual credentials, specifically his suffering for the sake of Christ. For Paul, suffering was not a mark of weakness, but rather a hallmark of his commitment to the gospel. Through his numerous letters, Paul shared the difficulties and tribulations he faced in his service to Christ. From persecutions and imprisonments to internal and physical fights. However, in the midst of these trials, Paul found strength in his faith and in the highest purpose of his life, which was to preach the message of salvation in Jesus Christ. Paul has left an indelible legacy as an example of fervor and passion for Christ. His life and teachings continue to inspire millions of people around the world, reminding us of the importance of a deep commitment to the faith and cause of Christ. Paul not only proclaimed the gospel with courage and dedication, but he also lived his faith authentically and passionately. Despite facing countless challenges and sufferings for the sake of the gospel, he never wavered in his commitment to Christ and his mission to share the message of salvation. His example reminds us that being a follower of Christ is not simply a matter of words, but of action and sacrifice. Paul's life is marked by his total dedication to Christ, his love for the church, and his desire to see others know and experience the redeeming love of God. Now, let's analyze in detail Paul's suffering as recorded in his different letters, focusing specifically on the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verses 16 to 33. The false apostles had invaded the Corinthian church. They were, without a doubt, Aramaic-speaking Jews. They tried to use their ancestry and heritage to belittle the apostle, who came from foreign lands, such as Tarsus in Cilicia. They boasted of their lineage according to the flesh. Here it is clear that his opponents were Jewish teachers who claimed to have a gospel and authority far superior to that of Paul. In this context, the apostle Paul mentions his sufferings for Christ. Although he does so in total disagreement with his will, he is forced to present his credentials as an apostle. He considers this action as meaningless nonsense, and even comparing himself to the so-called super apostles seems absurd to him. However, he recognizes that he does so not for his own self-interest, but for the cause of the gospel that he is committed to proclaim. Let's read verses 16 to 18. Again, I say it, do not think that I am a fool for speaking like this, but even if you think so, listen to me, just as you would to a foolish person, while I boast a little too. Such boasting is not from the Lord, but I act like a fool. Since others boast about their human achievements, I will too. Now, Paul will boast too he was also a Hebrew. this term designating Jews who spoke Hebrew or Aramaic, as opposed to those who only spoke Greek. Paul, like any Jew, and even better than most, was versed in the study of the Jewish scriptures in their original languages. Furthermore, he was fluent in the Aramaic dialect. Paul, on one occasion, declared his origin and education, born in Tarsus, but raised and educated in Jerusalem, under the tutelage of Gamaliel. So, although Paul did not consider himself in any way inferior to the super-apostles, in Corinth he presented his true credentials as a servant of Christ, unlike them, who did not have a single mark for Christ's sake. Now, let's look at Paul's suffering below. Paul's first credential lies in his prolific work as a minister of Christ. As an apostle, he surpasses his opponents in every aspect because of the extraordinary breadth of his work. This breadth is manifested in his numerous and arduous evangelistic campaigns and in his tireless missionary work, which covers multiple regions and communities. Paul had worked diligently and hard to bring the gospel to the Gentiles, and in comparison, what had those Judaizers done? Let's read Romans chapter 15, verses 18 and 19. For I would not dare to speak except of what Christ has done through me for the obedience of the Gentiles, in word and deed, with power of signs and wonders, in the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and around to Illyricum, I have filled everything with the gospel of Christ. Dear listeners, this is how a true servant of God shows his credentials, through hard service. In contrast, super apostles consider being a minister of Christ to be a matter of privilege. In their opinion, the higher their position as a minister, the less they should work, and the more they should be served by others. The second credential, lashes without number. Paul could say, I am a minister of Christ because I have been beaten many times for the sake of Jesus. Let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 25. Are you servants of Christ? I know I sound crazy, but I've served it a lot more. I have worked harder, been imprisoned more often, been whipped countless times, and faced death repeatedly. On 5 separate occasions, the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. They whipped me 3 times with rods. I was stoned once. 3 times I suffered shipwrecks. I once spent an entire night and the next day drifting at sea. "5 times," says Paul, "I have received 39 stripes. This was a Jewish punishment. Jewish law established how it should be administered according to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 to 3. The normal count was 40 lashes, but it could not be exceeded that figure because otherwise the punishment would have to be applied to the whipper himself. For that reason, the count was reduced to 39. An ancient Jewish writing describes the procedure for receiving whipping in a Jewish court. The criminal's 2 hands are tied to a post, and then the synagogue servant pulls or tears his clothes until his chest and shoulders are bare. A stone or block is placed behind him, where the servant stands. The servant will have in his hands a whip made of skin, divided into 4 ends. The whipper places 1/3 on the criminal's chest, another third on his right shoulder, and the other third on his left. The man who receives the punishment is neither sitting nor standing, but crouching at all times. And the man who hits does it with all his strength with 1 hand. The target hits the prisoner on the shoulder. The end of the strap must reach the navel. You will give 1/3 of the lashes from the front and 2/3 from the back. If the prisoner dies instantly, the minister is not guilty. But if he is given 1 too many lashes and dies, the minister must escape exile because of him. That's what Paul suffered 5 times, a whipping so severe that he could die in it. Paul also says, 3 times, I have been beaten with rods. That was a Roman punishment. The magistrate's assistants were called lictors, and they were equipped with birch rods with which criminals guilty of serious crimes were punished. That punishment had been applied to Paul 3 times. It was not legal for it to be inflicted, because under Roman law it was a crime to whip a Roman citizen. But when the crowd became violent and the magistrate was weak, Paul, although a Roman citizen, had to suffer this punishment. The most remembered scourge received was in Philippi. The third credential, imprisonment. Paul could say, I am a minister of Christ because I have spent a lot of time in prison for the sake of Jesus. Paul talks about being in prison many times. The Bible does not accurately record the number of times Paul was imprisoned. The most surprising was in Philippian prison. Although the specific details regarding his imprisonments are not fully detailed in the scriptures, it is known that he faced numerous hardships and persecutions. Clement Romanus, an important first-century church father, notes that Paul was imprisoned 7 times, further highlighting the intensity of the trials he endured in his dedication to Christian ministry. Dear listener, imagine what Paul's body must have been like, marked and scarred for all he suffered for the cause of Christ. This should make us reflect deeply. While it is true that in our context the persecutions are not of that magnitude, but we continue to carry the marks of Christ in different ways. The 4th credential, in danger of death many times. Paul could say, I am a minister of Christ because I have been close to my death for the sake of Jesus. We know that Paul was close to death when an angry crowd tried to execute him by stoning in Lystra, but there were other times too. Let's read Acts chapter 14, verse 19. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and managed to get the crowd on their side. They stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, thinking he was dead. Not all the trials that Paul suffered were directly at the hands of men. He was sometimes tormented by the convulsions of nature. That is why the apostle says, in verse 25 of chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, 3 times I suffered shipwrecks. I once spent an entire night and the next day drifting at sea. Over and over again, Paul speaks of the dangers of his travels. It is true that in his time the roads and seas were safer than they had been in previous times, but they were still very dangerous. In general, ancient people were not enthusiastic about the sea. How pleasant it is, Lucretius said, to be on the shore and see the poor unfortunate sailors having a bad time. None of the shipwrecks mentioned here have been recorded anywhere. 5 sea voyages are recorded in Acts, but nothing is said about a shipwreck. The shipwreck in Acts chapter 27 verses 1 to 44 on the way to Rome took place later. With reference to when Paul says, "For a night and a day, I have been like a shipwrecked man on the high seas." Again, no experience is recorded in Acts that corresponds to this. However, a castaway at sea is a person who has been left adrift on the ocean after their boat has sunk or been destroyed. This situation involves floating or surviving in the middle of the sea, generally with limited resources and without a safe boat, until being rescued or finding dry land. It is an extremely dangerous condition due to exposure to the elements, lack of clean water and food, and the threat from marine animals. But by the grace of God, Paul survived. The 5th credential, a stoning. Paul could say, I am a minister of Christ because I was stoned for his sake. Paul's stoning at Lystra occurred during his first missionary journey, as recounted in Acts chapter 14. After healing a lame man, the inhabitants of Lystra tried to worship Paul and Barnabas as gods. However, Jews from Antioch and Iconium incited the crowd against Paul, who was stoned and left for dead. Surprisingly, Paul got up and returned to the city before leaving the next day for Derbe to continue his mission. This event highlights the persecution he faced and his unwavering dedication to his ministry. The 6th credential, various dangers. Paul could say, I am a minister of Christ because I go through many dangers for the cause of the gospel. Let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 26. I have been on many very long journeys. I faced dangers from rivers and thieves. I faced dangers from my own people, the Jews, and also from the Gentiles. I faced dangers in cities, in deserts, and in seas, and I faced dangers from men who claim to be believers but are not. If we look at the maps at the back of most Bibles, we will usually find one titled, Paul's Missionary Journeys. By following the lines that show the general routes he followed, thinking about how rudimentary the means of transportation of those times were, one becomes more aware of the depth of meaning of this expression. The apostle also says, "I have been on many very long journeys." As for the old roads, bandits still abounded. According to Epictetus, he said that the roads were plagued by thieves. Therefore, one did not venture to travel alone, but rather hoped to have company, such as a legate, a quaestor, or a proconsul, with whom one could travel safely. However, Pablo would not have official company. Seneca warned that any day a bandit could cut one's throat, since it was common for travelers to be held hostage and held for ransom. Despite this constant danger, Paul, being of an adventurous nature, continued on his journeys for the cause of Christ. Paul then goes on to relate 8 different types of danger that he had encountered. There were dangers from rivers, with reference to rivers and streams of water. There were dangers from thieves, because many of the routes he traveled were infested with bandits. He faced dangers from his own nation, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles, to whom he sought to bring the gospel. There were dangers in the cities, such as Lystra, Philippi, Corinth, and Ephesus. He also faced dangers in unpopulated areas, perhaps referring to the sparsely populated regions of Asia Minor and Europe. Finally, there were dangers among false brothers, which undoubtedly refers to the Jewish legalists who presented themselves as Christian teachers. These numerous and varied dangers show Paul's courage and determination in his evangelizing mission, despite the constant obstacles and risks he faced. His 7th credential, various afflictions. Paul could say, "I am a minister of Christ because I endure all adversities for the love of Christ." Let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 27. "I have worked hard and for long hours and endured many sleepless nights. I have been hungry and thirsty and often left without anything to eat. I have shivered from the cold without having enough clothing to keep me warm." The term work refers to Paul's incessant activity, while fatigue involves the thought of exhaustion and work-related suffering. In many sleepless nights, on many of his trips, she undoubtedly had to sleep outdoors, but with dangers surrounding him on all sides, it would be necessary for him to spend many sleepless nights, on guard in case any danger approached. But it must also be understood that Paul was staying awake, interceding that God open doors for him to preach. "I have been hungry and thirsty, and often left without anything to eat." In our modern world, we are isolated from the difficulties that Paul faced. We can get water and food and warmth more easily than Paul could. Paul lived a hard life as a missionary, traveling and preaching the gospel. The great apostle was sometimes forced to suffer hunger and thirst in his activities of service to the Lord. Another version translates it as fasts. They may refer to those of a voluntary nature, but more likely he was forced into them due to lack of food, although Paul was a man who fasted constantly because of the work of God. Let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 5. "In scourgings, in prisons, in tumults, in work, in sleepless nights, in fasting." Undoubtedly, the Apostle Paul was characterized by his dedication to prayer, fasting, and vigil. The Apostle also says, "I have shivered from the cold, without having enough clothing to keep me warm." The sudden changes in weather, coupled with the fact that he was often poorly shod and poorly dressed, added these extreme forms of discomfort to his life. Dear listener, it was not just the fact of a difficult life that made Paul a true minister of Christ. Many people have difficult lives, but in no way are they servants of Jesus. But Paul freely chose all of these dangers and difficulties, because he could have lived differently if he had so chosen. But he didn't want to do it. He wanted to serve Jesus. And if these difficulties were part of serving Jesus, he accepted them. How could the man who lived this life be happy? Because he died to himself. Because Paul could say, "I am crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." Because of this, Paul could practice what he preached when he wrote, "We also glory in tribulations." This was not only a spiritual way of speaking on Paul's part, he actually lived it, Paul was able to say, and live what he wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and 18. For our present difficulties are small and will not last long. However, they produce for us a glory that will last forever and that outweighs the difficulties. So we don't look at the difficulties we now see. Instead, we fix our eyes on things that cannot be seen. For the things we can see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will remain forever. The greatest apostles and the Corinthian Christians who bought into his worldly lies must have thought Paul was crazy on this point. They found no point in glorying in these tribulations in which Paul gloried. For them, such tribulations said, "God is not with me. I'm a loser. I'm weak. I am not happy. My life is very difficult." They could only glory in the image of power and the appearance of success. If they did not have such an image, they felt as if God was against them. They thought this way because their way of thinking was worldly, instead of having the mind of Jesus, as reflected in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 and 11. Redpath said, "Such is the price Paul paid. What does that do to you? Do you congratulate yourself because you can avoid these tribulations? 1 week living the way Paul lived, and that would be enough. But Paul went through it his entire life and gloried in his weaknesses. The dangers of Paul's life were actually harsh enough to kill a man, but nothing and no one could kill him until God finished his purpose with Paul on this earth." Eighth credential, his concern for the churches. Paul could say, "I am a minister of Christ because I am aware of the churches and I assist them." Let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 28 and 29. "And in addition to other things, what comes over me every day, concern for all the churches. Who gets sick, and I don't get sick? Who is made to stumble, and I am not indignant?" The dangers Paul mentioned were not everyday events, but his concern for all the churches never left him. Pablo's burdens were not only physical, but also emotional. Redpath says of the phrase "cluster every day," "I cannot possibly convey to you adequately in the English language the force of that statement. I tried to imagine it in terms of being drowned under a sheet, or being attacked and crushed by a large animal, since I cannot use such strong words to express what Paul, in effect, said. That which brings me down, that which weighs on me like an unbearable burden, that which is something I can never shake day or night. He is with me always. I haven't had a vacation from that. Care, compassion, concern for all the churches is upon me daily." Hughes said, Paul's concern was not unbelief. This anxiety was based not only on the disturbing reports that reached his ears, but in his knowledge of the savage subtlety of the enemy of souls, who, he realized, would stop at nothing in his attempts to overthrow the work of the gospel. Dear listener, Paul carried the constant burden of all the Christian churches in his heart every day. How significant that this is the culmination of all his other trials. Paul was a true shepherd. He loved God's people and cared for them. He was not a hired shepherd, but a true under-shepherd of the Lord Jesus. Far worse than occasional physical suffering, Paul had to bear the daily and constant weight of his concern for the churches, those who were weak and sickly in faith, or those who were stumbled into sin, were the cause of his intense emotional pain. My beloved, what is the glory of Paul? What are his credentials as an apostle that he was? Only his scars. The weakness to which Paul refers may be a specific illness or weakness. More likely, it is the life of tribulation and stress that he lived as a whole. The false apostles, those greatest apostles, would never dream of boasting in such things. They thought that any weakness made one look weak and separated from God. Despite that, Paul didn't care if he looked foolish in the eyes of the world, or those in the church who thought like the world. Paul lived with an eternal perspective, not a worldly perspective. Therefore, Paul's legacy is an invitation to passion, dedication, and selfless service to Christ and his community. His life is a living testimony of dedication and sacrifice, which challenges us to live with the same fervor and commitment for the gospel. It encourages us to fully commit to our faith, to serve others with love and generosity, and to strive to leave an indelible mark on the world around us. This is how we come to the end of this video. Share this video with your friends and family so they can also be inspired by Pablo's legacy. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, have a great day. Blessings.